Finally tonight, the troubles of General Motors. Our economics correspondent Paul Salmon of WGBH Boston has the story.
Last spring's graduating MBAs at Columbia University. Where were they headed?
How many of you are going to New York to go into Wall Street? How many to California and high tech? A few over here. How many to Detroit and the auto industry?
They still make cars in Detroit?
I'm sorry, what?
They make cars in Detroit?
They still make cars in Detroit, yes. How many people?
What about working for General Motors?
In one of my classes, we talk about the bankruptcy of GM in a few years. So you don't work for a company you think it's going to go bankrupt. You know?
General Motors isn't bankrupt, but the once great firm is on the rocks, having lost nearly $4 billion last year alone through September, recently announcing 30,000 layoffs. And at first glance, its long decline would seem to be GM's fault. Consider perhaps its foremost headache, its hulking healthcare insurance costs, for which workers pay next to nothing out of pocket and retirees very little. GM's Tom Kowaleski.
We have about 145,000 employees, active employees, and we have health care coverage for 1.1 million retirees, independents, and family members. Last year we spent $5.2 billion on health care coverage for all of our employees in the U.S. basically. It equates to about $1,500 a car.
That's more than the steel in an average car, and $1,500 that GM's foreign rivals with government health insurance don't pay. GM's got another cost disadvantage as well. Full pensions after 30 years of service, regardless of age. To pay for this largesse, tack on another $1,000 per car. The luscious benefit of all, however, may be GM's Jobs Bank. Workers whose plant closes can transfer elsewhere in the company, or if they choose not to, take classes, do community service, continue to get full pay, and never retire. So in Baltimore, when a GM plant closed recently, the jobless weren't exactly distraught.
How do you feel about this plant closing?
I feel really good. I'm happy.
Most of us are going to be in the job bank volunteering, and I'd like to go to school in the fall because I don't want to put all my eggs in GM's basket.
But does GM help you go to school?
Sure, they'll pay for us to go to school, and we'll continue to receive a paycheck. So that's great. I mean, it's a no-brainer.
Since his layoff at Flint's Buick plant, Dean Braid has cared for a quadriplegic friend.
I'd say I'm a rare exception where they've allowed me to help a single individual. But it's a case-by-case that the UAW and GM look at for those sort of opportunities for the Jobs Bank workers.
When you add the Jobs Bank to the pensions and health insurance tab, GM has a total cost disadvantage compared to its non-U.S. rivals of $2,500 or more per car before it even starts making one.
It's like an Olympic swimmer trying to swim with a couple bowling balls hanging around his neck. He's just not going to get very far.
David Cole, son of the man who designed the '55 Chevy and went on to become GM's president. The son is now a top industry analyst. Why, we asked, didn't regulators and investors squawk when GM negotiated such generous union deals?
Historically, you always viewed the company as a rock of Gibraltar. No matter what we did in bargaining and collective bargaining between union management, the company was always going to be there.
Why worry that benefits would balloon over time? Who knew that efficiency and foreign rivals would kill so many jobs, create so many pensioners so soon? No wonder regulators and stockholders look the other way. Today, profligacy is an easy charge. But GM's decline may have had as much to do with fate as its earlier success did. Flint, Michigan happened to be home to the carriage industry just when it began to go horseless. The next step was arguably luck too, says labor historian Neil Layton at Flint's GM Museum.
You know, the entrepreneurs come in and begin to pour some money into this to begin to mass produce cars.
A marketing genius named Will Durant starts selling Buicks and with backers buys up Cadillac, Oldsmobile, Oakland, later Pontiac, and then Chevrolet. By the 1930s, General Motors is said to have a model for every person purpose.
It converts to making weapons and aircraft engines, tanks, all of this type of thing.
In the auto plants?
In the auto plants.
Some say GM was smart, some say lucky, but it was perfectly placed when the war ended.
And there was all the pent-up demand from the war years when people couldn't buy houses or cars. And so in that period right after the war, car production, like every other kind, goes sky high.
Oldsmobile rockets ahead.
And with Europe and Japan flattened, China and the Soviet bloc iron curtained off, the U.S. was the world's premier economy, GM its industrial paragon.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA. America's the greatest land of all.
What was good for the country was good for General Motors, and vice versa, its chairman said in 1953. Because, in part, the first corporation to make $1 billion a year was forced by the United Auto Workers to share its bounty with labor. Between World War II and Vietnam, the real incomes of GM's blue-collar workers doubled.
Where else are you going to get out of high school and make back then $18,000 a year or $4.25 an hour, and everybody else is making $2?
Best benefits I've ever seen, the best pay I've ever seen thus far. You know, pay is amazing for a non-skilled hourly worker.
The pay and benefits blamed today for hobbling GM, that is, helped create America's universally envied middle class. At the same time, though, GM benefited from the great productivity boom. In 1979, GM had 600,000 workers. It now has 150,000, to turn out roughly the same number of cars. And this helps explain the jobs bank. Union activist Greg Shotwell.
They wanted to increase productivity. Now the UAW said, look it, if you're going to ask people to put forth ideas to eliminate their own jobs, I don't think you're going to get much help. So they made a deal. GM said, I'll tell you what, we will promise these people that if they eliminate their jobs through higher productivity, we will pay them.
In short, GM has a pretty good excuse for what at first might seem like monstrous mismanagement. Which is not to say GM's entirely blameless.
This is hallowed ground. This is where Chevrolet was born, and it covered this entire area with factories.
John Lovey, a lifelong GM manager, spent time at the vast Chevrolet complex in Flint, demolished in 2004. At its height, GM had half the U.S. car market.
Super turbine transmission and more.
It now has 1/4. And Lovey blames the drop on GM's stodgy bureaucracy.
It's just a failure of management, of arrogance, of not listening to people. They don't listen to the customer. They don't listen to the workforce. And they have all the answers, and they keep claiming they're trying, and they're unsuccessful, and they don't recognize that they need to change and seek new input and new knowledge.
It's the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Back at Columbia Business School, leadership professor Mike Feiner agrees.
It's a huge, bloated bureaucracy, very slow to change, very slow moving, big elephant hoofs that take forever to go from one step to the next.
The bottom line is they're paying themselves, their workers and their management, more than the value they're creating in the marketplace. They can't sell their cars for a price that will permit them to cover their costs.
And that's because, says economist Peter Marisi, consumers won't pay a premium for poor GM quality.
Here's Consumer Reports, and the new Malibu has come in with below average reliability.
Oh, yeah, it's got one of those little Consumer Report circles with a black bottom filled
with a half a black dot. This is a Saturn. This is a new SUV. According to this, it is at the bottom of the league in reliability. It has
that's got a black dot. That's the one you wouldn't even give to your worst enemy, kind of.
Well, right? Yes. If you buy this car, you really ought to have your mechanic on retainer, kind of like a big company does its lawyers.
No wonder, says Marisi, Toyota may overtake GM next year as America's favorite car maker.
What are you guys looking at?
Looking at Lexuses and Just station wagons and
Some SUVs.
yeah.
SUVs.
Yeah.
So SUVs, American cars?
No, we don't usually buy American cars.
Why not?
We've had better luck with foreign cars.
But again, it's not all GM's fault. Even though foreign makers have U.S. plants and workers, they retain much of that $2,500 per car cost advantage, says GM's Kovaleski.
That's a lot that competitors can use to either reduce the price of the car by that much, put added content without raising the price, put that kind of money multiplied by several million cars a year into research and development, new facilities, other kinds of dealership development, growth, market growth. That's a significant burden we carry.
The big news, according to GM, is that it's finally cutting costs, closing unprofitable plants, negotiating a cheaper health care deal with the union. Moreover, says Kovaleski,
we have had dramatic increases in productivity in our plants in North America over the last 5 years, coming from having some of the least efficient plants to now having some of the most efficient plants. We now have brands on the J.D. Power Initial Quality Survey that were not in the top 10, that are now in the top 5, not top 5, top 6, that are ahead of many individual Japanese brands.
Analyst Cole concurs.
I think they've got a good portfolio coming. For example, we've seen things like the Solstice and the Impala and a number of other vehicles that already in the marketplace are doing very well, but the high volume products are just around the corner, particularly the new trucks, which are dramatically improved in terms of fuel economy.
In addition, GM's become the #1 producer of cars in China, so there seem to be some signs of hope. On the other hand, right now, GM continues to decline. And that could cost all of us, says economist Peter Marisi.
Remember someone once said what's good for General Motors is good for America? Unfortunately, what's happening is what's bad for General Motors is terrible for America. It's disrupting the entire Midwestern economy, and it has broad consequences for the industrial competitiveness of American manufacturing.
An industrial competitiveness that's now more evident in the GM Museum than on its balance sheet. A museum whose promotion for an upcoming exhibit reminded us just how far the once mighty can fall.